First of all, I was thinking, oh, what would this have to do with the war in the trenches? And then we learned about the history of the building and all the dying soldiers were treated there, and just thinking, like, everything that's ever been in that room. And I love the fact that the bells are rang out every 15 minutes to honour the soldiers.
This was an advanced dressing station. It's near to the front lines. It was a place of safety. So if you were injured above there, you were taken down here and you received first aid. As soon as the battle stopped up there, you would be taken to a casualty clearing station, which was at Poppering, and the doctors judged whether you were going to survive or not. If you had lost more than 3 pints of blood, there was nothing we could do. We couldn't give you a transfusion. We didn't know how to do that, so you would die. If you had had a leg badly injured or something, we thought, right, okay, there's a chance to save you, we would send you to the casualty clearing station. If you had a lot of wounds in your guts, nothing we could do to save you, and therefore you would die. And you'd have been put in a ward, or sometimes in the air, if we didn't have enough buildings, and you would just be left to die. During the Vietnam War, when the Americans were fighting in Vietnam, do you know how many soldiers actually died during that? Any idea? In terms of percentage? 0.1%. Now, a lot of soldiers died, but 0.1 of the total fighting died. You know, in the First World War, you know what the percentage was of the British soldiers who died? 44% died of their injuries because we did not have the medicine to save them. In this place, we are told that the soldiers were laid around the walls on little kind of straw beds. And here in the centre, there was a table where the doctors would try and operate on you and save your life. This is one of these places where you can almost touch the past. Can you imagine if these stones could speak, what they would say to you? Can you think of the soldiers lying here, crying, groaning, moaning? And do you know what the last word that most of these young men would have said? They would have said, Mum. They would cry for their mum.
The crypt in our church made me feel quite emotional, and they told us about all the nurses who were unwell, and the people who were unwell and died of just the smallest disease and that, and it was really sad. And you did think a lot about the people who died there and that.
This place was also captured by the Germans in 1915. It was an advanced dressing station for the Germans as well. And they bled too, and they died. One of the soldiers, the German soldiers, who was injured here, came back in 1941. And he brought his friends with him, and he came into this very room, and he stood in this very spot, and he said where his friends had been and what had happened during the war. He had been gassed up there, and he was brought down here as a casualty. And he obviously survived the war. His name was the Führer of Germany, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was a soldier in the First World War. He was in this very room and stood in this very spot.
And the crypt made me feel quite shocked to think I'm standing in the very spot that all these soldiers were dying and being operated on, and the very spot that Adolf Hitler stood. And just thinking, if these walls could speak, what would they say?
Do you see where those wind towers are? Mm-hmm. And you see the spires of the church? Mm-hmm. That's Ypres. That's what it's all about. It's like the hub and the wheel, okay? So we're the Germans facing Ypres, firing over into there. And all this flat land in front of us here is the Ypres salient. This is where the British Army are, holding the Germans back. Away over on the right-hand side over there is Hill 60. That's where the first of the big mines was blown in June 1917. And that blew the Germans off the top of the high ground. Now over here on the right you'll see is a big kind of pencil tower. That's called the Irish Peace Tower, and it was built in 1998. And it was built by young people from North and South Ireland, and a lot of youngsters from Europe whose countries were involved in the war. And again, that's a sign of peace and reconciliation. and it's called the Irish Peace Tower. In the morning of Christmas Day 1914, the Germans got out the trenches and walked across no man's land up to the British. And the British got out to meet them, and when they met, they shook hands, and they swapped cigarettes. The British gave the Germans rum, the Germans gave the British schnapps, German brandy, and then somebody suggested they play a game of football. Have you ever heard of that famous Christmas truce? That's where it happened, in that field over there. Until the officers behind the lines, British and German, heard what was happening, and they were furious, because whichever side stopped fighting first would lose the war. So the Germans ordered their guns to fire into no man's land, and the British did the same to separate the sides. And as soon as the shells began to explode, both sides ran back to the trenches. And next morning, the killing began all over again. One of the officers in the trenches over there in 1915 was a young Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Scots Fusiliers. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill. While Winston Churchill was over there, Adolf Hitler was down here. Can you imagine the irony of all those millions of soldiers all over here? The Führer of Germany and the Prime Minister of Britain were within a couple of dozen yards of each other.
Gassed last night and gassed the night before. Gonna get gassed again if we never get gassed anymore.